The sterile smell of hospital disinfectant hung heavy in the air as Alexander paced the corridor outside room 312. His footsteps echoed against the polished floors, a rhythmic sound that matched the anxious beating of his heart. 3 days had passed since Elena's surgery, and the doctors remained cautiously optimistic about her recovery. The procedure to remove the tumor had been successful, but complications during recovery had everyone on edge. Alexander ran his hands through his disheveled dark hair, a habit he'd developed since childhood whenever stress overwhelmed him. As the eldest son of the Thornfield family, he'd always been the protector, the one who shouldered responsibility when others couldn't. Elena wasn't just his wife of 7 years. She was his anchor, the steady presence that kept their family grounded amidst the chaos of public life. The Thornfields weren't royalty, but their influence in the business and philanthropic world meant they lived under constant scrutiny. Alexander's father, Edmund, had built a financial empire that spanned 3 continents, while his stepmother, Victoria, had seamlessly integrated herself into high society circles after marrying into the family 5 years ago. The dynamics had always been complicated, but recent months had seen tensions escalate to breaking points. Elena's illness had revealed fractures in the family that Alexander hadn't fully recognized before. While he'd been consumed with managing her care and keeping their 2 young children, Sophie and James, stable during this frightening time, other family members seemed to have their own agendas. Victoria, in particular, had been making decisions about family matters without consultation, claiming she was simply trying to help during the crisis. The sound of expensive heels clicking against the hospital floor announced Victoria's arrival before Alexander saw her. She appeared around the corner with her usual entourage, her personal assistant Marcus carrying a tablet and phone, and her bodyguard Harrison, a mountain of a man whose presence commanded attention wherever he went. Victoria moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way, her perfectly styled blonde hair not showing a single strand out of place despite the early hour. "Alexander, darling." Victoria's voice carried that practiced sweetness she used in public settings, though her eyes held a calculating gleam. "I've been trying to reach you all morning. We need to discuss the children's arrangements while Elena recovers." Alexander felt his jaw tighten. They'd had this conversation before, and his position hadn't changed. "Sophie and James are staying with me, Victoria. We've already arranged for care during hospital visits." "That's hardly practical," Victoria replied, adjusting her designer handbag. "You're emotionally compromised right now, and the children need stability." "I've already spoken with the best boarding school in the region. They have immediate openings and excellent counseling programs for children dealing with family trauma." The word trauma hit Alexander like a physical blow. His children weren't traumatized. They were scared and worried about their mother, which was completely natural. The suggestion that they needed to be sent away during this critical time felt like another attempt by Victoria to insert herself into decisions that weren't hers to make. "Absolutely not." Alexander's voice carried more edge than he'd intended. "My children stay with me. That's final." Victoria's smile faltered slightly, revealing a flash of irritation. "Alexander, you're being unreasonable. Think about what's best for Sophie and James, not what makes you feel better about being a good father." The accusation stung because Alexander had been questioning his own parenting choices constantly since Elena's diagnosis. Was he doing enough? Were the children getting the emotional support they needed? But sending them away when their mother was fighting for her health seemed like abandonment, not protection. "I am thinking about what's best for them," Alexander replied firmly. "They need their family close, not shipped off to strangers." Harrison shifted slightly, his massive frame moving closer to Alexander in what could be interpreted as either protective positioning around Victoria or an intimidation tactic. Alexander noticed the movement and felt his protective instincts sharpen. The bodyguard's presence had always made him uncomfortable, partly because Harrison seemed more like Victoria's enforcer than simple security. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion somewhere more private," Victoria suggested, glancing around the hospital corridor where a few nurses and visitors were beginning to take notice of their increasingly tense conversation. "There's nothing more to discuss," Alexander stated. "The children stay with me." Victoria's composure cracked slightly, and her voice took on a harder edge. "You're making a mistake, Alexander. When Elena..." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "When Elena's condition potentially worsens, you'll need support systems in place. I'm offering practical solutions. The casual way Victoria spoke about Elena's condition potentially worsening sent a chill through Alexander. It sounded less like concern and more like expectation, as if she'd already decided Elena wouldn't recover fully. The realization that Victoria might be positioning herself to gain more control over family decisions in Elena's absence hit him like a revelation. Elena is recovering well, Alexander said firmly. The doctors are optimistic about her prognosis. Of course, darling. Victoria's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. I'm simply suggesting we prepare for various scenarios. It's what responsible family members do. Alexander felt anger building in his chest, a protective fury that he recognized from his childhood when bullies had targeted his younger cousin at school. Victoria's apparent readiness to assume Elena wouldn't recover, combined with her immediate move to take control of the children, revealed motivations that had nothing to do with family welfare and everything to do with power. The hospital intercom crackled to life, announcing visiting hours would begin in 30 minutes. Alexander glanced toward Elena's room, knowing she'd want to see the children when they arrived with his sister Margaret. The thought of his wife's gentle smile and the way her eyes lit up when Sophie and James bounded into the room filled him with determination. "Victoria, I appreciate your concern," Alexander said, his tone becoming more formal and distant. "But my family's arrangements are not up for discussion or debate. Elena and I make decisions about our children together, and that hasn't changed." Victoria's expression hardened, and she exchanged a quick glance with Harrison. The bodyguard stepped forward slightly, his presence becoming more obviously threatening. Alexander realized this wasn't going to end with polite disagreement. "Alexander," Victoria's voice dropped to a lower, more serious tone, "you're not thinking clearly. Grief and stress are clouding your judgment. Sometimes family members need to make difficult decisions for the greater good." The implication that Victoria considered herself the family member capable of making those decisions struck Alexander as both presumptuous and revealing. He wondered how long she'd been planning to position herself as the family's decision-maker, and whether Elena's illness had simply provided an unexpected opportunity. "My judgment is perfectly clear," Alexander replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his system. "And my children are not leaving my care." Harrison moved another step closer, his hand resting casually on his belt where Alexander knew he kept various security equipment. The message was unmistakable. Victoria wasn't making a request anymore. The sound of children's laughter echoed from the elevator bank, and Alexander's heart jumped. Sophie and James had arrived with Margaret for their morning visit with Elena. The last thing he wanted was for his children to witness a confrontation, but Victoria seemed determined to force the issue now. "Those children deserve better than watching their father fall apart," Victoria said, her voice rising slightly. "I won't stand by and watch them suffer because of your stubborn pride." Alexander felt something snap inside him. The suggestion that caring for his own children during their mother's illness constituted falling apart, combined with Victoria's obvious attempt to use intimidation through her bodyguard, triggered every protective instinct he possessed. The elevator doors opened, and Margaret appeared with Sophie and James, both children carrying handmade cards they'd created for their mother. Sophie, 8 years old with Elena's dark curls, spotted her father and broke into a run toward him. James, 6 and more cautious by nature, followed closely behind his sister. "Daddy," Sophie called out, her voice echoing in the corridor. "We made Mommy get-well cards with flowers." Alexander's heart clenched as he saw his children's innocent excitement about sharing their creations with Elena. The idea that Victoria thought they should be sent away from this family moment, from being able to show their love and support for their mother, filled him with protective rage. Harrison moved to position himself between Alexander and the approaching children, as if following some prearranged signal from Victoria. The bodyguard's massive frame created an intimidating barrier, and Alexander saw Sophie slow her run, confusion replacing excitement on her young face. "Get away from her!" Alexander's voice came out as a growl, every syllable filled with paternal fury. "Get away from my daughter." But Harrison didn't move. Instead, he seemed to plant himself more firmly in Sophie's path, his cold eyes fixed on Alexander as if daring him to take action. Victoria stood behind her bodyguard, her expression triumphant. as if she'd orchestrated this moment to prove her point about Alexander's emotional state. The sight of his daughter's frightened face, the way James had instinctively moved to hide behind Margaret, and the casual cruelty of using intimidation tactics against children pushed Alexander beyond rational thought. In that instant, he wasn't a businessman or public figure weighing consequences. He was simply a father whose children were being threatened. Alexander lunged forward with explosive force, his shoulder catching Harrison in the midsection despite the bodyguard's significant size advantage. The impact sent both men crashing into the hospital wall, and the sound of the collision echoed through the corridor like a gunshot. Hospital staff began running toward the commotion, and Alexander could hear Margaret quickly ushering the children away from the confrontation. As Alexander grappled with Harrison, his only thought was protecting his family from people who would use fear and intimidation to control children. The confrontation had revealed Victoria's true nature, and Alexander knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle for his family's future. Hospital security arrived within minutes of the altercation, their radios crackling with urgent communications as they separated Alexander and Harrison. Dr. Patricia Chen, Elena's primary physician, appeared moments later, her expression grave as she assessed the situation. The pristine hospital corridor now showed signs of the confrontation. A dented section of wall where Harrison had been slammed, scattered papers from Victoria's assistant's tablet, and several concerned staff members trying to restore order. Alexander found himself in the hospital administrator's office an hour later, his knuckles scraped and his shirt torn at the shoulder. Across from him sat Victoria, her composure restored and her appearance once again immaculate, though Alexander noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she sipped water from a paper cup. Harrison stood nearby, sporting a bruised jaw but otherwise appearing unaffected by their physical encounter. "Mr. Thornfield," Hospital Administrator Janet Walsh began, her tone professional but clearly strained. "While we understand family tensions can run high during medical crises, physical altercations on hospital property are completely unacceptable. We're considering whether to ban all involved parties from the premises." The threat hit Alexander like a physical blow. Being banned from the hospital would mean being separated from Elena during her recovery, unable to be present for medical updates or provide the emotional support she needed. He realized Victoria might have anticipated this outcome, perhaps even planned for it, as a way to isolate Elena and gain more control over family decisions. "Dr. Walsh," Alexander said carefully, "I take full responsibility for my actions. However, I was protecting my children from what I perceived as intimidation. My wife's recovery depends partly on family support, and separating us would harm her healing process." Victoria leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the concerned tone she used so effectively in public.
"Janet, if I may, Alexander has been under tremendous stress."
Perhaps what he needs is some time away to process his emotions, while others handle the practical responsibilities. Alexander felt anger rising again, but forced himself to remain calm. Victoria's suggestion sounded reasonable on the surface, but he recognized it as another attempt to remove him from decision-making roles while Elena was vulnerable. Dr. Chen entered the office, carrying Elena's medical chart and wearing the expression Alexander had learned to read over the past few days. Something had changed, and not necessarily for the better. "I need to update you all on Elena's condition," Dr. Chen began. "She developed an infection at the surgical site overnight. We've started aggressive antibiotic treatment, but her recovery timeline has been extended significantly. She'll need intensive care for at least another week, possibly longer." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. Elena had been improving steadily. This setback felt like a cruel reversal of progress. Victoria, however, seemed almost unsurprised by the news, her expression showing concern but not shock. "What caused the infection?" Alexander asked, his mind racing through possibilities. "These complications can occur in any surgical patient," Dr. Caresi, Chen explained. "Elena's immune system is working hard to fight it, but she'll need complete rest and minimal stress during this critical period." Victoria seized the moment. Dr. Ted Minstubbles, "Chen, given these developments, don't you think Elena needs the most stable environment possible? Perhaps fewer visitors, more controlled access?" Alexander realized Victoria was maneuvering to limit his access to Elena, using the medical situation to support her agenda. The timing felt too convenient. and he found himself wondering about the sudden appearance of complications that hadn't been present in earlier medical reports. Elena specifically asked to see the children this morning, Dr. Chen said, consulting her notes. Family support is crucial for recovery, but we do need to maintain a calm environment. The children upset Elena yesterday, Victoria interjected smoothly. Alexander mentioned they were crying and asking difficult questions about their mother's condition. Perhaps it's time to consider alternative arrangements that protect Elena's peace of mind. Alexander stared at Victoria in shock. He'd never mentioned any such thing, and in fact, Elena's spirits had visibly lifted during the children's previous visits. Sophie and James had been remarkably brave and positive, creating artwork and telling stories to make their mother smile. That's completely untrue, Alexander said firmly. Elena specifically looks forward to seeing Sophie and James. Their visits are the highlight of her day. Alexander, you're emotionally compromised. Victoria replied, her tone suggesting patient tolerance for his mental state. You might not be accurately perceiving how stressful these visits are for Elena. Dr. Chen looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with being drawn into what was obviously a family conflict. Hospital Administrator Walsh checked her watch, suggesting she wanted to resolve the immediate security issue without becoming involved in complex family dynamics. Detective Ray Morrison arrived at that moment, having been called by hospital security about the earlier altercation. A tall man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair and sharp eyes, Morrison had handled numerous cases involving prominent families and understood the complexities that wealth and influence could introduce to seemingly straightforward situations. I understand there was an incident here this morning, Morrison said, pulling out a notebook. I'd like to speak with everyone involved separately to get a clear picture of what happened. Alexander was the first to give his statement, describing Victoria's attempt to remove the children from his care and Harrison's intimidating behavior toward Sophie. He found himself also mentioning his concerns about Victoria's reaction to Elena's medical setback and her immediate move to restrict access. Has there been ongoing conflict between you and your stepmother? Morrison asked. Not until Elena's illness, Alexander admitted, but Victoria seems to view this crisis as an opportunity to make changes to our family structure. She's been pushing for decisions that would increase her influence over my children and potentially over Elena's care. Morrison made notes, his expression neutral but attentive. Alexander could see the detective processing information, looking for patterns and motivations that might not be immediately obvious. Victoria's interview painted a very different picture. She described Alexander as increasingly unstable, making poor decisions for the children, and becoming violent when family members tried to offer reasonable alternatives. According to her account, Harrison had merely been trying to protect everyone when Alexander attacked without provocation. Mrs. Thornfield, Morrison said carefully, why was it important to discuss the children's living arrangements in a hospital corridor rather than in a private family meeting? Victoria paused slightly before answering.
Alexander has been avoiding family discussions about practical matters.
I felt we needed to address the situation immediately, especially with Elena's condition becoming more serious. Morrison noted the timeline discrepancy. Victoria had initiated the conversation about sending the children away before anyone knew about Elena's infection. Her emphasis on Elena's worsening condition also seemed to assume knowledge of medical developments that hadn't yet been announced. Margaret, Alexander's sister, provided crucial context when Morrison interviewed her. As someone who'd witnessed the entire confrontation while accompanying the children, her perspective offered insights that contradicted Victoria's narrative. Victoria's bodyguard deliberately blocked the children from reaching their father, Margaret stated firmly. Sophie was running to Alexander with excitement about seeing her mother, and this man positioned himself to intimidate an 8-year-old girl. That's when Alexander reacted. Morrison found Margaret's account particularly credible because she had no apparent motivation to distort the truth and had been focused primarily on protecting the children during the confrontation. Dr. Forcier Chen's medical records also raised questions for Morrison. Elena's infection, while not impossible, seemed to have developed very suddenly. The detective made notes to follow up on the timeline of her medical care and who had access to her room overnight. Hospital security footage provided the most objective evidence of the morning's events. The recordings clearly showed Harrison moving to block the children's path and maintaining that position even after Alexander's verbal warning. The footage also captured Victoria's satisfied expression in the moments before Alexander's physical reaction, suggesting she had anticipated or even orchestrated the confrontation. As Morrison reviewed the evidence, a concerning pattern emerged. Victoria seemed to be positioned to benefit from both Elena's illness and Alexander's removal from family decision-making roles. Her immediate push to send the children away, combined with her ready acceptance of Elena's medical setback, suggested someone who had been planning for various scenarios rather than simply reacting to unexpected developments. The detective's investigation took an interesting turn when he discovered that Victoria had contacted the exclusive boarding school she'd mentioned 3 days before Elena developed the infection. The school's admissions record showed she'd not only inquired about immediate placement, but had also submitted preliminary enrollment materials for Sophie and James. Morrison also learned that Victoria had scheduled meetings with family lawyers for the following week, ostensibly to update estate planning in light of Elena's health concerns. The timing suggested someone preparing for long-term changes rather than supporting short-term medical recovery. When Morrison shared these discoveries with Alexander, the implications became clear. Victoria's actions suggested she had been preparing for Elena's extended incapacitation, or worse, and had been positioning herself to assume control over important family decisions. "Detective Morrison," Alexander said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "are you suggesting Victoria might have known about Elena's complications before they occurred?" "I'm suggesting we need to look more carefully at the timeline of events and who had access to information and opportunities," Morrison replied. "Your wife's medical situation, the sudden family crisis, and the convenient solutions your stepmother had ready. It's worth investigating whether this is coincidence or something more deliberate." Alexander felt a chill run through him as the detective's implications became clear. If Victoria had somehow orchestrated or contributed to Elena's medical complications, then his family was in far greater danger than he'd realized. The confrontation in the hospital corridor hadn't just been about custody of the children, it had been about something much more sinister. Morrison's investigation was just beginning, but already the evidence suggested that Elena's illness might not be the random medical crisis it appeared to be. Someone with access, opportunity, and motivation had positioned themselves to benefit from the family's tragedy, and Alexander realized he needed to protect not just his children but Elena herself from threats that came from within their own family. Detective Morrison's investigation took on new urgency as he delved deeper into the Thornfield family dynamics. What had initially appeared to be a simple assault case was revealing layers of deception and potential criminal activity that reached far beyond a hospital corridor confrontation. Morrison had seen wealthy families destroy themselves from within before, but the calculated nature of Victoria's actions suggested something more sinister than typical inheritance disputes. Alexander sat in Morrison's cramped downtown office 2 days after the hospital incident, reviewing a timeline of events that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Elena's medical records, financial documents, and family communications told a story of systematic manipulation that had been building for months before Elena's illness became apparent. "Your stepmother began liquidating significant assets from joint accounts 6 weeks ago," Morrison explained, spreading bank statements across his desk. "She claimed it was for family emergency preparations, but the timing preceded any medical crisis." Alexander studied the documents with growing alarm. Victoria had moved nearly $2 million from various family investment accounts into private holdings, always staying just under the transaction limits that would require additional approvals from other family members. The transfers had been technically legal since she had legitimate access to many accounts, but the pattern suggested someone preparing for a significant change in family circumstances. "She also increased the insurance policies on both you and Elena 3 months ago," Morrison continued. The insurance agent noted that Victoria specifically asked about payout timelines and what circumstances might accelerate claims processing. The implications hit Alexander like physical blows. Victoria hadn't just been positioning herself to benefit from Elena's illness. She'd been actively preparing for possibilities that suggested she knew something devastating was coming. The detective's evidence painted a picture of someone who had been planning for tragedy rather than simply reacting to it. Morrison's next revelation was even more chilling. Hospital security footage from Elena's floor showed Victoria making several late-night visits that weren't recorded in the official visitor logs. These visits occurred during nursing shift changes when the floor had minimal supervision, and Victoria had used her family connection to bypass normal check-in procedures. What was she doing during those visits? Alexander asked, though he dreaded the answer. "We're still investigating, but the timing is significant," Morrison replied grimly. Elena's infection appeared shortly after one of these undocumented visits. "We've requested a full review of her medical care and anyone who had access to her room or treatment." Dr. Chen had been cooperative with the investigation, providing detailed records of Elena's treatment and recovery timeline. What emerged was a pattern of unexpected complications that coincided with periods when Victoria had been present in the hospital. Elena's initial surgery had gone perfectly, but setbacks began occurring after Victoria started her unofficial visits. The hospital's pharmacy director, Dr. Michael Torres, reviewed medication logs at Morrison's request and discovered several irregularities. Supplies had been accessed using codes that traced back to Victoria's interactions with sympathetic nursing staff. While nothing directly implicated her in tampering with Elena's care, the access patterns raised serious questions about how someone without medical training could influence treatment protocols. Alexander's investigation into Victoria's background revealed additional concerning information. Before marrying his father, Victoria had worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative, giving her knowledge of medications and their effects. She'd also been married twice before, both marriages ending with her husband's deaths under circumstances that had raised initial suspicions but never led to charges. Her first husband died of what appeared to be a heart attack, but toxicology results were inconclusive, Morrison explained. The second husband had a fall downstairs that investigators found suspicious but couldn't prove was anything other than an accident. In both cases, Victoria inherited significant assets. The pattern was becoming clear to Alexander, though it felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Victoria hadn't married into his family out of love for his father. She'd targeted them as her next opportunity for financial gain and social advancement. Elena's illness provided the perfect cover for eliminating obstacles to Victoria's control over the family fortune. Alexander's father, Edmund, had been largely absent from recent family crises, spending most of his time at their overseas offices, while Elena struggled with her health. When Alexander finally reached him by phone, Edmund's reaction to the allegations against Victoria was dismissive and defensive. "Alexander, you're clearly under enormous stress," Edmund said, his voice carrying the patronizing tone that had frustrated Alexander since childhood. "Victoria has been nothing but supportive during this difficult time. These conspiracy theories aren't helping Elena's recovery." The conversation revealed another obstacle Alexander hadn't fully considered: his father's complete faith in Victoria and reluctance to believe she could be capable of harm. Edmund had always been susceptible to manipulation by people who presented themselves as loyal and supportive, and Victoria had perfected the role of devoted wife and stepmother. Margaret proved to be Alexander's most valuable ally in uncovering the truth. As someone who'd maintained closer relationships with extended family members and household staff, she had access to information that formal investigations might miss. Her conversations with longtime family employees revealed a pattern of subtle intimidation and manipulation that Victoria had used to ensure loyalty. The housekeeping staff mentioned that Victoria has been asking detailed questions about Elena's daily routines and health habits for months, Margaret reported. She wanted to know about medications, dietary supplements, everything Elena consumed regularly. This information provided Morrison with new investigative directions. If Victoria had been systematically gathering information about Elena's health routines, she could have identified opportunities to introduce substances that might cause complications or worsen existing conditions. The detective's interview with the family's longtime housekeeper, Maria Santos, provided the breakthrough they needed. Maria had worked for the Thornfields for over 15 years and had observed Victoria's behavior with growing concern, though she'd been afraid to speak up about her suspicions. "Mrs. Victoria, she always asking about Miss Elena's vitamins and supplements," Maria explained in her careful English. "She say she want to help make sure Miss Elena taking everything right. But something feel wrong about all the questions." Maria described how Victoria had insisted on personally organizing Elena's daily medications and supplements, claiming she wanted to ensure proper timing and dosages. She'd also observed Victoria researching various health conditions online and printing articles about medication interactions and complications. Most damning was Maria's observation that Victoria had been secretly photographing Elena's prescription bottles and medical documents, claiming she needed the information to coordinate with doctors, but never sharing the photos with Elena or Alexander. Morrison's investigation expanded to include forensic analysis of Elena's hair and blood samples, looking for substances that might not show up in standard medical testing. The results wouldn't be available for several days, but the detective had enough circumstantial evidence to seek a court order restricting Victoria's access to Elena and requiring supervised visits for any family interactions. Alexander felt a mixture of relief and horror as the investigation progressed. Relief that Elena would be protected from further harm, but horror at the realization of how close his family had come to complete destruction. Victoria's plan had been sophisticated and patient, designed to eliminate Elena while positioning herself as the grieving stepmother who stepped in to care for the children and manage the family assets. The children, Sophie and James, had been staying with Margaret since the hospital confrontation, shielded from the worst details of the investigation, but aware that serious family problems were being resolved. Alexander spent every possible moment with them, trying to provide stability while processing the betrayal that had nearly cost him everything. Elena's condition began improving almost immediately after Victoria's access was restricted. The mysterious complications that had plagued her recovery started resolving, and her doctors expressed surprise at the sudden positive change. Dr. Chen cautiously suggested that whatever had been causing the setbacks seemed to have been eliminated from Elena's environment. Morrison's case against Victoria was building systematically, but he knew that proving attempted murder or systematic poisoning required absolute certainty. Wealthy defendants had resources to challenge evidence and create reasonable doubt, so the investigation needed to be bulletproof before any arrests were made. The detective's next step involved examining Victoria's financial activities more closely, particularly her recent communications with lawyers and financial advisors. If she'd been planning to benefit from Elena's death or incapacitation, there would likely be paper trails showing her preparations for assuming control over family assets. What Morrison discovered exceeded even his darkest suspicions. Victoria had not only been planning for Elena's demise, she'd been systematically positioning herself to eliminate anyone who might challenge her control over the Thornfield fortune. Alexander himself had been a target, and only the public nature of the hospital confrontation had disrupted whatever plans Victoria had made for him. The investigation was far from over, but Alexander finally understood the full scope of the danger his family had faced. Victoria's apparent love and support had been a carefully constructed facade, hiding a predator who viewed the Thornfield family not as people to cherish, but as obstacles to be eliminated in pursuit of wealth and power. As Elena continued to recover and the children slowly began to understand that their family was safe, Alexander realized that the confrontation in the hospital corridor, as violent and frightening as it had been, might have saved their lives by exposing Victoria's true nature before she could complete her deadly plans. The forensic results arrived on a gray Thursday morning, delivered to Detective Morrison's office in sealed envelopes that would either confirm their worst suspicions or send the investigation in an entirely new direction. Alexander sat across from Morrison's desk, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, while Margaret paced behind him, unable to sit still as they waited for answers that would determine their family's future. Dr. Patricia Chen joined them via video call, her expression grave as she prepared to review the medical implications of whatever the tests revealed. Elena's recovery had continued to progress remarkably since Victoria's access had been restricted, but everyone knew that proving intentional harm required scientific certainty that couldn't be dismissed by expensive defense attorneys. The blood analysis shows elevated levels of digitalis, Morrison began, reading from the forensic report. Not enough to cause immediate death, but sufficient to cause the cardiac irregularities and complications Elena experienced. The hair follicle tests confirm exposure over a period of approximately 6 weeks. Alexander felt the room spin slightly as the confirmation hit him. Digitalis was a heart medication that could be deadly in incorrect doses or when given to someone who didn't need it. Victoria's background in pharmaceutical sales would have given her knowledge of such substances and their effects when administered systematically in small doses. The pattern suggests regular, small exposures designed to weaken Elena's system and create complications that would appear natural. Chen explained from the video screen. Someone with medical knowledge would understand how to administer just enough to cause problems without leaving obvious evidence. Margaret stopped pacing and stared at the screen. You're saying Victoria was slowly poisoning Elena? The evidence strongly suggests systematic poisoning designed to appear like natural medical complications, Morrison confirmed. Victoria had access, opportunity, and demonstrated knowledge of pharmaceuticals. She also had clear financial and personal motivations. Alexander's phone buzzed with an urgent message from the hospital security office. Victoria had attempted to visit Elena that morning, despite the court-ordered restrictions, and had become violent when denied access. Hospital security was requesting police assistance with an increasingly volatile situation. She knows, Alexander said, understanding immediately. Victoria knows we're closing in on her. Morrison grabbed his coat and radio, coordinating with patrol units while Alexander and Margaret rushed to follow him to the hospital. During the drive, Alexander's mind raced through possibilities of what Victoria might do when cornered. Someone who had systematically poisoned a family member and planned multiple murders wasn't likely to surrender quietly when faced with exposure. The hospital was in partial lockdown when they arrived, with security personnel stationed at elevators and stairwells to prevent unauthorized access to patient floors. Victoria had apparently arrived with Harrison and a team of lawyers, demanding immediate access to Elena and threatening legal action against anyone who interfered with her family rights. Alexander could hear Victoria's voice echoing through the lobby before he saw her, the carefully modulated tones she used in public replaced by something sharper and more desperate. She stood near the information desk, surrounded by her entourage, gesturing dramatically as she spoke to someone on her phone. This is completely unacceptable, Victoria was saying, her voice carrying across the lobby. I am a member of this family, and I will not be treated like a criminal based on the paranoid delusions of a man who clearly cannot handle stress. Hospital Administrator Walsh looked harried as she tried to maintain order while respecting the legal restrictions that protected Elena from unwanted contact. The presence of media representatives who had somehow learned about the family drama added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. Detective Morrison approached Victoria with two uniformed officers, his expression professional but alert to the potential for escalation. Victoria's lawyers immediately positioned themselves between her and the detective, while Harrison scanned the lobby for potential threats or escape routes. Mrs. Thornfield, Morrison said clearly, I have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the attempted murder of Elena Thornfield. You have the right to remain silent. The lobby erupted into chaos as Victoria's facade finally shattered completely. She lunged toward the elevator bank, screaming accusations and threats, while her lawyers tried to restrain her and demand explanations from the detective. Harrison moved to block the officer's path, his massive frame creating a barrier between Victoria and the authorities. You can't prove anything, Victoria shrieked, her carefully maintained appearance dissolving into something wild and desperate.
Elena was sick before I even met this family.
Alexander is trying to destroy me because he can't accept that his precious wife might not survive. The public breakdown revealed the rage and calculation that Victoria had hidden behind her supportive stepmother persona. Alexander watched with a mixture of horror and relief as the woman who had nearly destroyed his family showed her true nature to everyone present, including the media representatives who were recording every moment. Hospital security moved to clear the area as the arrest escalated into a physical confrontation. Harrison refused to step aside, leading to a tense standoff with police officers who were prepared for resistance but hoping to avoid violence in a medical facility full of vulnerable patients. Alexander felt a powerful urge to confront Victoria directly, to demand answers about why she had targeted Elena and threatened his children. But Margaret grabbed his arm, recognizing the danger of emotional confrontation when the situation was already spiraling out of control. Let the police handle it, Margaret urged. Don't give her lawyers anything to use against you. Victoria's lawyers were already working their phones, clearly attempting to arrange bail and legal strategies even as their client was being handcuffed. The speed of their response suggested they had anticipated this possibility and prepared contingency plans. Dr. Chen arrived in the lobby, having rushed from Elena's floor with urgent news. Elena had been asking about the commotion and wanted to see Alexander immediately. The stress of the situation was affecting her recovery, and medical staff needed the crisis resolved quickly to protect their patient's health. Elena doesn't know the details of the investigation yet, Dr. Chen explained quietly. We've been protecting her from stress during recovery, but she's aware something serious is happening with the family. Alexander realized he faced an impossible choice: continue dealing with Victoria's arrest and its aftermath, or go to Elena and provide the support she needed during this frightening time. The decision was made easier by Victoria's continued screaming and threats, which were creating exactly the kind of stress that could harm Elena's recovery. As police finally managed to separate Victoria from her bodyguard and begin the arrest process, she fixed her gaze on Alexander with pure hatred. "You think you've won," she screamed, struggling against the handcuffs, "but this family will destroy itself without me. Elena will never fully recover, and your children will grow up knowing their father chose paranoia over family loyalty." The venom in Victoria's voice confirmed what Alexander had suspected. Even facing arrest for attempted murder, she remained focused on inflicting maximum emotional damage on the family she had tried to destroy. Her words were designed to plant seeds of doubt and guilt that would haunt him long after she was gone. Morrison handled the arrest with professional efficiency, but Alexander could see the detective's tension as he processed Victoria for transport. Cases involving wealthy families attracted intense scrutiny, and any procedural mistakes could provide grounds for defense attorneys to challenge the evidence. Harrison's arrest proved more complicated, as he faced charges of intimidating witnesses and interfering with police duties, but his lawyers claimed he had simply been protecting his employer from what appeared to be harassment. The bodyguard remained silent throughout the process, his expression revealing nothing about his knowledge of Victoria's activities. As the lobby began to clear and normal hospital operations resumed, Alexander finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had been prevented. Victoria's systematic poisoning of Elena, her plans to gain control of the children, and her apparent willingness to eliminate anyone who threatened her goals represented a level of evil that he struggled to comprehend. Margaret accompanied Alexander to Elena's room, where they faced the difficult task of explaining the morning's events without causing additional stress to someone still recovering from both illness and poisoning. Elena had always been the family's emotional center, the person who helped everyone else process difficult situations. But now she needed protection and support while her body healed from Victoria's attacks. The confrontation in the hospital lobby marked the end of Victoria's ability to harm their family. But Alexander knew the legal proceedings and emotional recovery would continue for months or even years. The woman who had nearly destroyed them had been stopped, but the scars of her betrayal would take time to heal. As he took Elena's hand and saw the trust and love in her eyes, Alexander realized that Victoria's greatest failure had been underestimating the strength of the genuine family bonds she had tried to exploit. Her manipulation and violence had been no match for the authentic connections that held the Thornfield family together through their darkest hour. 6 months after Victoria's arrest, the Thornfield family gathered in the same hospital where their nightmare had begun, but this time for Elena's final medical clearance. The woman who had nearly died from systematic poisoning now showed no traces of the digitalis that had ravaged her system, and her doctors expressed amazement at her complete recovery. Elena's strength, both physical and emotional, had proven stronger than Victoria's carefully planned destruction. Alexander watched his wife laugh with their children in the hospital garden, a sound he had feared he might never hear again during those terrifying weeks when Elena's condition had seemed to worsen daily. Sophie and James had grown during the crisis, showing resilience that both amazed and humbled him as they adapted to the knowledge that someone they had trusted had tried to hurt their mother. Detective Morrison joined them for the final medical appointment, carrying updates about Victoria's legal proceedings that would officially close this chapter of their lives. The investigation had expanded far beyond the Thornfield family, revealing a pattern of similar crimes in Victoria's past that stretched back over 2 decades. The forensic accountants found evidence linking Victoria to the suspicious deaths of both her previous husbands, Morrison reported as they sat in Dr. Chen's office. The toxicology results from exhumed remains confirmed digitalis poisoning in both cases, administered over months in the same pattern we documented with Elena. Alexander felt a chill despite the warm spring sunshine streaming through the office windows. Victoria's attempt to destroy his family had been part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior that had claimed multiple victims over the years. The woman who had presented herself as a loving stepmother had been a serial killer who specialized in long-term poisoning, designed to appear like natural medical complications. Dr. Chen reviewed Elena's final test results with evident satisfaction, her professional pride in her patient's recovery clear in every word. Elena's heart function is completely normal, and there's no lasting damage from the digitalis exposure. Her body has eliminated all traces of the poison, and she's medically cleared for all normal activities. Elena squeezed Alexander's hand, her eyes bright with tears of relief and gratitude. The ordeal had strengthened their marriage in unexpected ways, forcing them to confront how precious their time together truly was, and how much they depended on each other for emotional stability during crises. "What about Victoria's sentence?" Elena asked Morrison quietly, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the question. "She pleaded guilty to attempted murder, conspiracy, and fraud charges to avoid the death penalty," Morrison explained. "She'll spend the rest of her life in prison with no possibility of parole. Her accomplices, including Harrison, received significant sentences for their roles in the conspiracy. The plea agreement had spared the family the trauma of a lengthy trial, but it had also provided closure by confirming Victoria's guilt beyond any doubt. Alexander's father, Edmund, had been devastated by the revelation of his wife's true nature, but he had finally accepted the evidence and was working to rebuild relationships with his son and grandchildren. Margaret had proven herself to be the family's backbone during the crisis, managing practical arrangements and providing emotional support when Alexander and Elena couldn't handle everything themselves. Her relationship with her brother had deepened into something stronger than childhood bonds, forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual protection. The legal aftermath had been complex, requiring months of work to untangle Victoria's financial manipulations and restore family assets to their proper accounts. Forensic accountants had traced nearly $5 million that Victoria had diverted for her personal use, most of which was recoverable now that her schemes had been exposed. Alexander's business had suffered during the crisis as he focused entirely on his family's safety and recovery, but loyal employees and business partners had stepped up to maintain operations during his absence. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about delegation and the importance of surrounding himself with trustworthy people. The children had received counseling to help them process the betrayal by someone they had trusted and viewed as family. Sophie, with the resilience of youth, seemed to have adapted well, though she occasionally asked penetrating questions about how to recognize when people were lying or trying to hurt others. James, more sensitive by nature, had struggled more with nightmares and anxiety, but therapy was helping him rebuild his sense of safety and trust. Dr. Patricia Chen had become more than Elena's physician during the ordeal. She had become a family friend who understood both the medical and emotional trauma they had endured. Her willingness to support Detective Morrison's investigation and provide expert testimony had been crucial in building the case against Victoria. "I've seen families destroyed by much less traumatic events," Dr. Chen observed as she completed Elena's final examination. "The fact that you've all emerged stronger and more united speaks to the genuine love and commitment that Victoria tried so hard to undermine." The hospital staff who had witnessed the dramatic confrontation 6 months earlier treated the family like celebrities during this final visit. Many nurses and security personnel stopped by to express their relief at Elena's recovery and their satisfaction that justice had been served. The story of Victoria's exposure had become legendary within the hospital, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could hide behind familiar faces. Alexander reflected on how the violent confrontation that had started everything had actually been a moment of divine intervention, preventing Victoria from completing her plans before they could cause irreparable damage. His protective instincts as a father had triggered exactly the right response at exactly the right moment, exposing Victoria's true nature and setting in motion the investigation that saved his family. The media attention had been intense initially, but Alexander had hired skilled public relations professionals who helped control the narrative and protect the family's privacy during the legal proceedings. The story of Victoria's systematic poisoning and attempted family destruction had fascinated the public. but careful management had prevented the children from being exposed to the worst aspects of the coverage. Edmund's relationship with his son and daughter-in-law remained strained, but healing was beginning as he worked to understand how Victoria had manipulated him so completely. The older man's guilt over bringing a predator into his family was genuine, and his efforts to make amends suggested that reconciliation might be possible with time and patience. As they prepared to leave the hospital for the final time as patients, Alina turned to take one last look at the place where their ordeal had begun and nearly ended in tragedy. The sterile corridors that had once felt like a prison now seemed like a fortress where their family had been protected and ultimately saved. "I keep thinking about all the other families Victoria hurt over the years," Elena said quietly to Alexander as they walked toward the exit. "At least our suffering helped expose her and prevent future victims." Alexander nodded, understanding that Elena needed to find meaning in their trauma beyond just personal survival. The investigation had revealed at least 6 previous victims of Victoria's schemes, and her conviction had provided closure for families who had lost loved ones without ever understanding the true cause. Sophie and James ran ahead toward the parking garage, their energy and excitement about returning to completely normal life, infectious and healing. Alexander watched them with profound gratitude, knowing how close he had come to losing not just Elena, but potentially his children as well, to Victoria's comprehensive plan for family destruction. Detective Morrison walked with them to their car, his professional relationship with the family having evolved into genuine friendship forged through shared crisis and mutual respect. The detective's thorough investigation and unwillingness to dismiss Alexander's concerns had literally saved their lives. "Cases like this remind me why I became a police officer," Morrison said as they reached the parking garage. "Sometimes the system works exactly as it should, protecting innocent people from those who would harm them." As Alexander started the car and watched his recovered wife and healthy children settle in for the drive home, he realized that Victoria's greatest miscalculation had been underestimating the power of genuine love and family loyalty. Her manipulation and violence had been no match for the authentic bonds that held them together, bonds that had only grown stronger under pressure. The confrontation that had begun with the words "get away from her" had ultimately saved them all, triggering a chain of events that exposed evil, delivered justice, and allowed healing to begin. Alexander knew they would carry scars from Victoria's betrayal, but they would carry them together as a family that had survived the worst and emerged united, stronger and more grateful for each day they shared. The drive home took them past the courthouse where Victoria would spend her remaining years, but Alexander didn't slow down or look back. His focus was entirely on the future, on the family that had been tested by evil and proven unbreakable, on the children who would grow up knowing they were protected and cherished, and on the woman beside him who had fought her way back from the edge of death to reclaim her life and her role as the heart of their family. Justice had been served, recovery was complete, and the Thornfield family was finally truly safe to build their future, without fear of the predator who had nearly destroyed them all.